Matt Bell again from Active Motors, and today I'm going to walk you through unboxing of the Actev Arrow. When you first receive your smart cart, it will arrive in a box similar to this. It's quite heavy, about 100 pounds, so it's important to use 2 people to move it. The first thing you're going to do is quickly inspect the box itself and make sure there's no obvious damage. While we've improved our packaging over the last couple of years, it's still possible that it could have been dropped sometime in shipment, and it's very important to make sure that you take note of any damage before you open it. The first step in opening the box is to remove these small white clips that make these grab handles. To do that, oftentimes they're quite loose. All you do is you pull the tab and pull them out from the box. There's 4 of them. Once you get all 4, it's sometimes helpful to have a second person to help lift the box top off. The first thing you're going to notice when you take the top off the box, hopefully, is the Open Me First envelope. Inside here there's a quick start guide with some important warning information as well as the instruction pamphlet. This will get you going as far as learning what you've purchased, again some safety rules, and all the instructions to put your go-kart together. Also in the top of the box, on the first level of the styrofoam separator, you're going to find your standard battery, the active wrench, which is used to put together all the free parts on your go-kart, a steering cover that we affectionately call the taco, with some hardware for the steering cover and the seat back, the standard charger, a flag, the steering shaft with the steering wheel attached, the seat back itself. Be quite careful with this. This is basically the entire brain of the go-kart. And the other half of the steering shroud or steering cover. Important to set all these free parts down in a nice soft place and in a location where things aren't going to roll away and you're going to lose them. All of these parts are obviously in the box for a reason. We will be needing them. The cart won't function properly without any parts missing. So again, very important to keep track of all these free parts. Finally, time to uncover the Arrow itself. So you'll just grab the styrofoam divider, pull it off, and set it aside. Before we finally remove the go-kart from its packaging, we're going to have to take this rear cover out. Very carefully just remove it from the styrofoam that it's placed in. This is cosmetic. It has a matte finish on the outside. It's important not to set it with the matte finish against anything hard like the ground. It's usually okay just to set it on the ground on its edge. You'll need a second person again to take the cart out of the box itself, with 2 people, 1 person at the back, 1 person at the front. You can grab the front wheels and the little carry handle on the rear and carefully set it on the ground. The first thing that we're going to install on the go-kart itself is the steering shaft. You'll notice that the large nut on the end of the steering shaft, which in the instructions, if you're following along, is called nut B, is actually threaded on there. You'll have to remove that before attempting to put it on the go-kart. There's also bolt A, which goes through the stem that holds the steering shaft. You'll have to remove that as well. Sometimes for these bolts that come attached to the go-kart or the steering shaft, you will actually have to use the active wrench to loosen it up. So that you can remove it. Before we install the steering shaft itself, it's good practice to actually place any free hardware that you're dealing with in the seat of the go-kart. It's difficult to scratch a seat with the hardware, and it also ensures that this isn't going to roll off and go anywhere where you're going to lose it. To actually put this on the go-kart, you're going to line up the steering support with the steering mount and install it all the way. Take bolt A and loosely thread it in to the steering support. Don't tighten it too much yet because it actually pinches the steering shaft. You're not going to be able to install it. Line up the steering pivot, which is this lower mount here, and also line up the tie rod with the steering arm. It can sometimes be difficult to line everything up, but it will go in. Push as hard as you can to make sure that that's fully seated before installing nut B. Once the steering shaft is fully seated in that lower mount or the steering pivot, you're going to use the active wrench, first with the 10mm side up on the upper steering support and pull it pretty tight, and then with the 19mm side down on the bottom. It's important while using the active wrench, especially on this steering hardware, to not tighten so much and not slip off with the wrench where you're going to hit any of the plastic parts. Nut B, the large nut that holds the steering shaft to the lower pivot or this lower mount, is one of the more important pieces of hardware on the go-kart. It is a safety item. If it's too loose and the locking feature of the nut isn't fully engaged on the threads in the steering shaft can actually come out of the go-kart, which means whoever's driving the go-kart no longer has any steering. It's important to test and make sure that that nut is fully seated. You can see this by looking at the back of the nut where it should touch that pivot. If it's not fully seated against that pivot, it's not tight enough. You can also make it too tight. This isn't a safety concern as much as an inconvenience. You can test this by lifting up the front of the cart and just turning the steering back and forth. With it in the air, it should move relatively freely with maybe some mild restriction. It shouldn't feel so tight that you can't turn it with one hand. The next step, again, if you're following along in the instructions, is to install the upper and lower steering covers. To do this, you have to first remove the pre-installed 3 screws, I believe the instructions call them screw C, from the go-kart itself. The next step, if you're following along in the instructions, is to install the steering covers, starting with the lower one. Carefully install this over the steering support and the steering shaft. I say carefully because the plastic is oftentimes pulled together a little bit and a little bit sharp. You don't want to scratch any of the coatings on the go-kart. Simply pull the 2 edges apart and carefully slide it over the steering shaft, making sure it's fully seated and that you can engage the screws. I hate this part. The upper steering cover, you're simply going to drop it over the lower steering cover. The next part to install is the upper steering cover. Before we do this, we're going to empty the contents of that small hardware bag again into the seat of the go-kart. You're going to find 4 very small screws. They're designed to cut into plastic, and those are the ones you're going to use for this upper steering cover. To install the upper steering cover, simply drop it over the lower steering cover, doing your best to line up the holes. Using the same Phillips head screwdriver, I'm going to simply thread in one of the screws lightly, moving down to the bottom, thread in one of the other screws, again lightly. You can continue with the other 2 screws, tightening them the rest of the way once everything's lined up. The next step in getting this cart moving is installing the seat back. Again, take it easy with this. This is where all the electronics are that run the go-kart. To install this, you're going to get behind the cart, carefully holding this, and slide it down on top of the 2 posts. Now, some seat backs are easier than others. Sometimes it takes a couple of nudges to get it fully seated. You're going to take the screws that are the bolts that came in the hardware package and slide them through and thread them into the seat back. You can start by doing this just hand tight and move on to the active wrench. Once the seat back is on and the hardware is tight, we can go ahead and install some of the wires in the back. These wires are connected together by a cable tie. All you have to do is twist and push them through to remove the cable tie. The right motor goes to the right side. Make sure red is on the right. If you really work at it, it is possible to plug these in the wrong way. Nothing really dangerous happens, but the cart will definitely not function properly. Once the motors are connected, the next cable to plug in is the CAN bus connection. The green wire goes on right and it gets plugged in where it says CAN bus. It is labeled on the back of the seat back and it can be a little bit difficult to put in, but make sure it's fully connected before you let it go. The next thing to install is the rear cover. This simply snaps over the back. What I like to do is actually, before we start putting this on, is remove the screw that will tether the rear cover to the go-kart. That actually sits in front of the rear axle support, and it can be a little bit tricky to get to. It should just be finger tight, but if it is tighter, just go ahead and use a Phillips screwdriver again. Good Lord, it's the longest screw in history. To snap on the rear cover, make sure the clips are roughly vertical, but be careful. If they aren't vertical and you're twisting, don't twist very far out here on this tab. Twist close to the plastic itself. You're simply going to pull the tether out of the way, line up the clips to the grooves on that rear bar, and snap it on. It should hinge nicely. At this point, be careful letting go because it can swing and hit the ground. You're going to put a nice mark in your rear seat back or in your rear cover. To finally tighten the tether that holds the rear cover on, use the smallest screwdriver that you can find. I'm cheating and using a really stubby one. The standard battery, if you remember, came in the upper portion of the styrofoam divider that the cart was in. Simply take it out of the black box and place it in the tray after moving the Velcro straps out of the way. All right. To plug the battery in, again, make sure red is on right. Find the large center plug and press in. Make sure you hear 2 clicks, and by pulling lightly on the bottom of the connector, make sure it's fully seated. To latch the rear cover, simply grab each side, spread it out slightly, find the post, and push in on both sides. And that's basically it. Once the cart is fully charged and the pedals are adjusted to your driver's height, it's now ready to be driven. Please, one more time, look over the safety rules, find all the warning labels that are on the cart and the instructions, and get outside and have a great time with the Actev Arrow.